What would you do if the life you built was a lie? I found out the hard way, betrayed by the person I trusted most. But this isn't just a story of heartbreak, it's about fighting for what truly matters. Before that day, my life followed a steady, predictable rhythm. Trucking wasn't just a job, it had become a way of life. The long hours spent on the road, the solitude, and the constant motion, all of it fit me perfectly. I never expected anything more than the steady hum of the engine beneath me, miles stretching endlessly into the horizon, and the quiet reassurance that I had a purpose. But life has a funny way of throwing unexpected turns at you when you're least prepared. Years earlier, during a restless summer in North Dakota, I worked on a ranch owned by a man named Walt. I was young, eager to prove myself, and impatient to find direction. Walt wasn't a man of many words, but his lessons lingered. One day, he told me, "Opportunities don't come knocking, kid. You either cross paths with them, or you don't." At the time, I shrugged it off as the ramblings of a weathered old cowboy. I didn't yet grasp how life had a way of making those words painfully true. It wasn't the first time I'd stood at a crossroads. Before trucking, I ran a small auto repair business. I had the skills, the tools, and a solid work ethic. What I lacked was patience, especially when it came to managing people. The shop only lasted 2 years before it folded, taking with it my dreams of settling down in one place. That failure pushed me toward the open road, where I could depend on myself and leave behind the frustrations of leadership. Looking back now, I can't help but question if Marcy ever truly loved me or if I was just a convenient part of the life she envisioned for herself. She had this uncanny ability to twist reality to her advantage, effortlessly reshaping the narrative to maintain control. If things didn't go her way, she would portray herself as the wounded victim with such conviction that even she seemed to believe the lie. My realization about who she truly was didn't come from a single act of betrayal. It was the culmination of countless small, seemingly harmless moments, each one quietly adding weight to the truth I could no longer ignore. For too long, I had ignored the growing weight of my doubts. Out on the road, with endless hours and miles stretched before me, I had plenty of time to think. I often wondered whether I had chosen this life or if it had somehow chosen me. Occasionally, I entertained the idea of returning to something stable and predictable, something that didn't keep me moving all the time. But whenever I tried to imagine that, something deep inside pulled me forward. Maybe it was the lure of freedom. Or maybe it was fear of stopping long enough to face the uncertainty of what might come next. That's why, when I saw a handwritten sign on the side of the road that read, "For sale before the county takes it," I didn't realize I was approaching the biggest turning point of my life. At first, it seemed like a small, insignificant decision, just a passing moment of curiosity. But looking back now, I see it was the moment that everything changed. 5 years ago, by sheer coincidence, I unknowingly laid the foundation for what would later be known as the Village of Circumstances Unincorporated. It started as nothing more than an unremarkable patch of land in the middle of nowhere. Yet, somehow, that land evolved into a thriving community of 349 people. None of it was part of any grand plan, but life has a way of surprising you. I was fortunate enough to stumble upon an opportunity when I least expected it. That day had started off like any other. I just finished hauling a trailer of sterilized bandages to a facility in Texas. It was a routine delivery, just another job to check off the list. Afterward, I contacted dispatch to let them know I was available for my next assignment. They came back with an offer that was too good to pass up, a nearby pickup that would bring me home 2 days earlier than planned. Time at home was a rare treat, and the load paid double the usual rate. As someone with a dangerous goods license, I was one of the few drivers qualified for the job. The pickup point was only a half-hour away, so I refueled and headed straight there. The load was ready when I arrived, and after securing it quickly, I hit the road again with renewed focus. The drop-off was an hour from home, and with double pay on the line, I knew every saved mile would count. Instead of sticking to the assigned route, I took a calculated risk and opted for a shortcut. In trucking, time is money, and a shorter route meant more time at home. But sometimes, fate has a way of steering you toward places and people you never expected. It was on that road, with an unconventional turn of events just ahead, that I found myself at the beginning of something much larger than I could have imagined. I called my father, who managed our family's trust, to discuss an idea that had been forming in my mind. After some negotiation, we came to a fair agreement to purchase the farm. The deal allowed the couple who lived there to remain in their home under a long-term lease with reduced rent. I could see the relief wash over them. When the man shook my hand, it came with a firm promise of future support if I ever needed it, a promise that would later prove invaluable. Before leaving, I proposed that we section off 10 acres near the main intersection to build a gas station, an idea that would also pay off in the future. As life moved forward, I crossed paths with Jack, a fellow trucker who couldn't have been more different from me. He was brash, arrogant, and, to put it bluntly, untrustworthy. Despite those gut feelings, I had no idea just how closely he would become entangled in my life. One day, my worst fears materialized. I pulled over near my home to see Marcy stepping out of the house, Jack by her side. My daughters followed them, and I saw Jack carrying a rig bag, standard gear for someone in our line of work. My stomach dropped. The way Marcy and Jack interacted made everything crystal clear. Their body language spoke volumes, they weren't bothering to hide their relationship. It was obvious that this had been going on for quite some time. I instinctively pulled out my phone and recorded the scene as they loaded my daughters into the car and drove away, completely unaware of my presence. Afterward, I couldn't shake the sense that something was seriously wrong. When I arrived back at the house, everything felt off. I climbed the stairs slowly, hesitating outside the door to the third floor. I took a deep breath before pushing it open, and what I saw left me stunned. The entire floor had been renovated, sunlight poured through an open curtain. That was strange enough, considering those curtains were always drawn when I was home. But what really hit me was the realization of what Marcy had been hiding from me. The space had been transformed into a new master bedroom, much larger than our own. I looked around in disbelief and opened the closets. The first was filled with men's clothes, far too large to belong to me. The second held Marcy's outfits, including dresses and lingerie I'd never seen her wear before. This wasn't just a fling, it was an entirely separate life she had built without me. Any shred of doubt I had vanished in that moment. Marcy had never truly chosen me. I was always her second option. My thoughts raced to my daughters. What had she told them about me? What kind of lies had they been fed? I pulled out my phone once again, capturing every detail, the bed, the closets, the adult DVDs neatly hidden away. I even held one of Jack's shirts against my chest to highlight just how much larger he was than me. With my heart pounding, I took one last glance around the house. I knew this wasn't just a betrayal, it was a complete dismantling of the life I thought we had built. Stepping outside, I made a quick call to someone I trusted, my voice steady but urgent. "I'll explain later," I said. "Right now, I need to make sure Marcy and her lover don't take my kids away from me." I picked up the phone and called the old farmer from whom we had purchased the land. "Any chance I can rent a room from you until my place is ready?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "You've got a room," he replied without hesitation, "but your money isn't good here." "I insist," I began, but he cut me off sharply. "Keith," he said firmly, "you and your family did more for us than we ever could have hoped. We owe you, big time." I sighed, knowing there was no point in arguing with him. His generosity ran deeper than pride, and in that moment, I was reminded of the unexpected kindness life sometimes offers when everything else is falling apart. Later that day, I sat across from Jace, my friend and business associate, and showed him the evidence. I kept my voice steady, though it wasn't easy. "This video, it's my wife, Marcy," I explained. "That's why I'm leaving her. Jace's fists tightened on the desk as he processed what I had shown him. "This was filmed in that hidden third-floor room?" he asked. "Yes," I confirmed. "Someone else recorded it. I don't know who, and frankly, I don't care anymore." Jace exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. "I'm sorry, Heath," he said after a moment. "Because of your son and my wife, I have no choice but to quit. I need to be home if I want any shot at custody of my daughters." Jace nodded, resigned, and picked up his phone. He instructed his secretary to cut my final check, with an additional $110 for expenses, and ensured my accounts at Jameson's Auto were fully paid. It was bittersweet, a chapter closing, but one I needed to end to focus on my family. After that, I drove straight to my daughter's elementary school. I met with the guidance counselor first, explaining the situation before the girls were brought from their classroom. As she stood to leave the room, I stopped her. "You should stay," I said quietly. She frowned. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I replied firmly. "I don't want to be accused of manipulating my kids." Something in my tone gave her pause. "Are you worried about that happening?" I sighed, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. "My wife is a state social worker," I explained. Her eyes widened slightly, and she pressed her lips into a thin line, understanding the implications. When my daughters arrived, I told them the truth, gently but clearly. I reassured them that, for now, they would stay with their mother, but I would fight to gain custody once I had a stable job and a home for them. The counselor spoke up, confirming everything I said. "Everything your father told you is true," she assured them. After hugging my girls goodbye, I turned to leave, only for the counselor to hand me a slip of paper. "Have your lawyer contact me," she said. "I'll give a statement. I've seen too many men get screwed in their divorce proceedings." I thanked her sincerely before heading out. My next stop was a local flower shop. "I need the deadest flowers you've got," I told the florist. She hesitated, blinking in confusion. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I continued. "Whatever's shriveled, wilted, and beyond saving." Her expression faltered as she realized I wasn't joking. It wasn't about revenge or theatrics, it was symbolic, an act of closure. I gathered the flowers and reflected on how much had gone unnoticed over the years. Jack was never home when I was. Unless our schedules aligned by chance, there was no way I could have known what was happening right under my nose. This life Marcy built with him had thrived in my absence, carefully timed, expertly hidden. Until now. I let out a long breath after speaking with John, the boss's son. His father had found out about the situation earlier today when I walked into the office and quit. John's expression darkened as I explained the circumstances. "You did the right thing, Heath." "No doubt about it," he said reassuringly. We talked for a while, sharing advice and perspectives, until John made a suggestion. "Why don't you move your truck into my garage tonight?" he offered. "Watch her and think things through. You might gain some clarity on your next steps." I nodded in appreciation. His offer was more than just a practical gesture, it was a lifeline when I needed one most. Meanwhile, the scene with Marcy began to play out as I had expected. I had left the dead flowers in her car, intentionally. When she opened the door and the rotten stench hit her, she gagged, staggering back in shock. For a moment, I thought she might be sick. Yet, even then, she didn't immediately put two and two together. The puzzled expression on her face revealed that she hadn't even considered that I had left the message. In her mind, it might have been from Jack, maybe a breakup gesture or something symbolic from him. Then my phone vibrated. It was a text from Lauren. "Calling you, but don't answer. We want you to hear what we say to Mom. She needs to hear the truth, just like you taught us." I put the phone on speaker and listened. "We understand now that Dad wasn't lying," Linda chimed in. "We kept our promise not to tell." "And wow, was it a surprise to Dad," Lauren added. Marcy's body stiffened as Lauren spoke again, her voice turning cold. He didn't even know about the third floor until today. You always told us not to lie, Mom. But I guess it's okay for you to lie to us and to Dad. Marcy's tears started flowing. She cried quietly at first, but as the weight of the situation sank in, the sobs grew louder. She wasn't just mourning the truth being revealed, she knew I was setting myself up perfectly for the legal battle ahead. As a social worker, she understood exactly how the courts would see this. Dad didn't know, Linda said. Uncle Jace quit his job today so Dad could get custody of us. Lauren continued, her words calculated but determined. The school counselor told us a long-distance truck driver wouldn't get custody. So Dad's changing careers. Marcy trembled as their voices piled on one truth after another. She realized that I wasn't making emotional decisions. I was moving forward strategically, taking all the right steps to ensure the court would side with me. After a long silence, Linda spoke again, delivering a blow that left Marcy shattered. Lauren and I have talked a lot about what you did, and we've decided something. Marcy barely raised her head as Linda continued, her voice steady and final. Mom, we might only be 12 now, she said, but soon we'll be old enough to choose where we want to live. Miss Connor told us that at 13, we can legally decide. And when that time comes, Lauren added, we'll be living with Dad. Linda followed up, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. We're calling Grandma to come get us. She and Grandpa will let us stay with them until Dad has everything ready. I watched from a distance through binoculars as Marcy read their text message. I saw her expression twist, the reality finally settling in. She understood, this wasn't a threat. It was a promise. If I chose to expose Marcy's double life, her lies, her financial deception, she would lose everything. And she knew it. Her defeated expression said it all. There was no happy ending here, not for her or Jack. He was just as ruined. If I decided to sue him for support, it would destroy him financially and permanently tie him to her in a way that neither of them could escape. 15 minutes later, my in-laws arrived. John, Marcy's father, cracked open his front door to listen to the chaos inside. We didn't have to strain to hear, they were yelling at each other, their shouts echoing through the house. John quietly led me to the kitchen, grabbed 2 cold beers from the fridge, and handed me one. I took a long drink before he finally spoke. Your daughters read the situation exactly right, Heath, he said. You should be proud. I nodded slowly, staring at the beer bottle in my hand. I am, I replied softly. John leaned against the counter, his gaze hardening. When the third-floor renovations were happening, Marcy told us you were renting the space out because you needed money. I frowned, caught off guard by the claim. The house was paid off, I said, shaking my head. We didn't need the money. We were taking our time with those renovations. John's eyes darkened, realization dawning on him. So she lied, he muttered. She's been lying to all of us. A grim silence hung between us for a moment before a hint of a smirk tugged at his lips. What the hell did you text her earlier? He asked. I took a slow sip of my coffee and replied, I just told her I wanted to know if Linda and Lauren, or Jax, are mine. John let out a low whistle and leaned back in disbelief. Jesus, Heath. You sure know how to shake things up. I continued, my voice steady. Jace told me he'd heard rumors for years. His son was supposedly involved with a married woman, and her clueless husband didn't have a hint of it. I shook my head and added, I just asked a question that needs answering, for all of us. John's face paled slightly as he processed what I had just said. He knew Jace's reputation. If Jace wanted the truth, he wouldn't stop until he found it, even if that truth came with painful consequences. I found out yesterday, I said quietly. I'm filing for divorce and suing Jack. The words tasted bitter, but they needed to be spoken. I knew the message would be making its rounds soon. This wasn't just going to be a tough day for Marcy and Jack, it was going to be a bad morning for a lot of people. After leaving John's place, I stopped at the friendly truck stop on the edge of town and ordered a trucker's breakfast. I parked my rig where I could see it clearly through the window as I ate. My thoughts were heavy, circling around everything that had unfolded. The hum of conversation and clatter of dishes filled the diner, but my mind was elsewhere. A voice suddenly interrupted my thoughts, pulling me back to the present. "I'm sorry, Heath. No man deserves what happened to you." I looked up from my plate and saw Marcy's younger sister, Maureen, standing by the booth. "Mind if I join you?" she asked softly. I nodded, and she slid into the seat across from me. Her expression was filled with both sympathy and curiosity as she pulled out her phone. I knew she had likely seen the messages and video I had sent out that morning. By the time she finished reviewing everything, her eyes glistened with tears. "What she did was bad," she whispered, shaking her head. "But this is worse." I nodded in agreement. "The video proves there was someone else involved, someone filming. And by the end of the day, everyone's going to know about it." Maureen wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket. "Jace is going public with it, isn't he?" I sighed deeply. "Yeah. He's not going to stop until he gets all the answers. And the truth is, both girls could be mine. Both could be Jack's. Or neither of them could be." Maureen swallowed hard, visibly shaken. "Jesus." She sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the situation. Eventually, I leaned back in the booth and shifted the conversation. "Out by that four-way stop near the land we bought, we own 10 acres, I explained. The plan is to subdivide it and sell off lots as the area develops. It'll be a good location for a store. There's nothing out there now, so it'll be a big convenience for both locals and passing traffic." Maureen gave me a skeptical look. "How'd you even find that place? Google Maps doesn't show anything around there." I chuckled softly. It was pure luck. I was cutting across the country to save time on a haul when I spotted a sign at a four-way stop. I followed the road and saw the steady traffic flow. It convinced me it was a solid opportunity. She nodded thoughtfully, seeing the sense in it. Later that day, I met with Bill, an old friend, who listened as I explained everything. By the time I was finished, he gave a firm nod. "The girls are welcome here anytime," he said with a smile. "Be nice to have kids around again. Gives me someone to grill for." I smiled at his offer and texted Maureen, "Come by every Friday and stay till Sunday. The girls are always welcome here." Her response came almost instantly, "It's a date." That evening, after the kids were in bed, Maureen and I sat outside under the stars, sipping coffee. The events of the last few days hung heavily between us. "It's been a crazy couple of days," she said, breaking the silence. "All hell's broken loose." I took a sip and nodded. "What's happened now?" "Everything's coming out," she replied. "Jack, he's the boy Marcy used to sneak out to see when we were teenagers. That's how long they've been involved." I shook my head in disbelief. "That explains a lot," I muttered. "You were her safety net," Maureen continued thoughtfully. "Jack was her wild side. She craved the excitement he gave her but never saw that he was using it to his advantage." Her words sank deep. In some twisted way, Marcy had been trapped by her own desires, drawn to the thrill Jack offered but always falling back on the stability I provided. It was a hard truth to swallow, but one that finally made sense of all the years of deception. I nodded thoughtfully. "Jack will run. He won't stick around for this." Maureen sighed, her gaze distant. "Once Jack moved in, their relationship became a common-law marriage," she said. "Marcy never thought of him as her second husband, but the law does. Her lawyer made it clear, after a year of living together, they shared the same legal rights as a married couple. That means your lawsuit will stick. The only real question now," I replied, is how much Jack will have to pay. Morin nodded in agreement. The lawyer had explained it all. Divorce court would heavily favor me. I had been deceived for years, and the evidence against Marcy was overwhelming. The only possible defense would have been if Marcy had charged Jack rent and had proof of it, but that wasn't the case. She had lived her life without considering the consequences, and now those consequences were knocking on her door. Saturday was a whirlwind of activity. Linda and Lauren couldn't contain their excitement as Bill taught them the basics of riding small motorcycles. Their laughter filled the air as they zipped around the yard, wide grins plastered on their faces. They picked it up quickly, but after 2 hours, Bill clapped his hands together. "That's enough for today," he said with a chuckle. "You'll feel it tomorrow." Sweaty and exhilarated, the girls exchanged a mischievous look. "One more lap," they begged in unison. Bill smirked. "Go on, then," he said with a wave of his hand. Later, after the girls had finished their riding lessons, we filed some important legal paperwork. Copies were made for records, and a notice of legal authority was issued, granting me the right to act on behalf of the girls. With everything official, the focus shifted once more to Marcy and Jack. Over the course of the conversation, I learned things I hadn't known before. By Friday morning, Jack was in Austin, Texas, picking up a medical shipment when he was served with the lawsuit. That same morning, Marcy was served at her office at Social Services. I was out walking when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcy. "Have you calmed down enough to talk?" I responded immediately. "There's no talking left to do." Word spread quickly. By the end of the day, the weight of reality had fully settled on Marcy and Jack. The walls they had built around their deceit were crumbling. Later that night, I sat outside with Morin after dinner, reflecting on everything that had unfolded. I shared with her that both Marcy and Jack had been served and showed her Marcy's last message. Morin sighed heavily. "You know, my sister can't explain her actions because doing that would mean admitting the truth to herself. And she's not ready for that." I exhaled slowly, rubbing my face. "Enough about your sister," I muttered, changing the subject. Morin placed her hand gently on my arm, grounding me in the moment. We spent the rest of the evening talking with Bill and his wife, Betty. Their warmth and steady support were a much-needed comfort. Bill shared that they had fostered children for years since they couldn't have kids of their own. "Betty's always been my rock," he said, his eyes softening as he glanced at her with affection. The next morning, the house came alive with activity. After breakfast, Linda and Lauren rode the motorcycles again before deciding it was time for a swim. We all headed to the pond, where Bill and Betty set up in lawn chairs. The rest of us splashed in the water, tossing a beach ball back and forth. Morin looked stunning in a white bikini, her auburn hair tucked neatly behind her ears. The way the sunlight glinted off the water made her look radiant. At one point, she moved closer to me, and without a word, we found ourselves locked in a quiet, intimate moment. Her eyes met mine, filled with a mix of warmth and understanding. Slowly, she leaned in, and I tilted my head to meet her halfway. Our lips met in a slow, deep kiss, gentle, yet profound. It was unlike anything I had experienced in years. In that moment, the noise of the world faded away. It was just us, two people finding comfort in each other after so much pain. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. In that moment with Morin, I felt more love than I ever had with Marcy. The depth of it caught me off guard, leaving me breathless. "Wow," I whispered softly. "That was intense." Morin smiled, her eyes full of warmth. "You have no idea how long I've waited for this." She leaned closer, pressing against me, the cool water flowing around us as we kissed again. This time it was deeper, slower, our tongues meeting in a rhythm that was both comforting and intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt something genuine, something real. The weight of past betrayals faded as we lost ourselves in each other. After some time, we finally pulled apart and swam to the shore. As we dried off, Morin shared something that left me stunned. "My sister asked me about you once," she said, brushing a strand of wet hair behind her ear. "She wanted to know how long I'd been in love with you." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "And what did you tell her?" Morin chuckled softly. "Since the summer before you married Marcy." I blinked in surprise. "Wow, that long?" She nodded. "Yeah, and it took all of this for you to finally see it." I exhaled deeply, processing her words. "What did she say after that?" Morin shrugged. "I was expecting a lecture, but all she said was, 'If it works out, I'll talk to your dad and make sure he accepts it.'" Her words carried more weight than I realized at first. Then she added something unexpected. "You know, our dad wasn't always as close to Marcy as people think. He was actually her sister's throwaway, someone she leaned on when she had nowhere else to turn. Marcy thanks her for that every day." We spent the rest of the weekend together, and by Sunday afternoon, I kissed Morin goodbye. We both knew things were far from over, but at least now, we had each other. Later that evening, I got a call with more news. Apparently, Jace's confrontation with Marcy had reached a boiling point. He was devastated, the voice on the other end explained. He thought Marcy had only been involved with Jack for 3 years. He had no idea it had been going on much longer. I rubbed my forehead in frustration. "How did he take it?" I asked. There was a pause before the response. "Not well. He stormed into the social services office and, in front of everyone, told Marcy that she was dead to him." I closed my eyes, letting the information sink in. I had expected anger, sure, but not something that final. Later, I called my mother-in-law to check on the legal situation. She didn't waste any time getting to the point. "Miss Connor has already provided a notarized statement for your lawyer," she informed me. "Good," I replied, feeling a small sense of relief. That was one less thing to worry about in the custody case. As I hung up the phone, I knew exactly what needed to be done next. Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone and began making the necessary arrangements. This wasn't just about revenge or justice anymore. It was about building a life, one that I could finally live on my own terms, free of the lies and shadows that had haunted me for far too long. I dialed Jace's number, and he answered with a mix of surprise and tension in his voice. "Heath. I need you to come to this address," I said, my tone serious. "Right now." 20 minutes later, his truck pulled up, and I met him outside. Without a word, I handed him the key to my house. "Go see for yourself," I told him. "And by the way, I found out who was behind the camera, filming Jack and Marcy. They're upstairs right now." Jace's expression hardened. He didn't ask any questions. He simply nodded and walked toward the house, each step heavy with purpose. I stood back and watched, my mind racing with thoughts of what he might be feeling in that moment. John observed from the window beside me. "What do you think he's going to do?" he asked quietly. I shook my head slowly. "I don't know," I replied. "But I feel bad for Jace. He didn't deserve this. No one does." The next morning, at 6 a.m., I pulled into my in-laws' driveway. Klaus was already up, waiting for me with a fresh pot of coffee. We sat together before the rest of the house stirred, and I walked him through everything, every revelation, every betrayal. His wife, Rose, was stunned when she saw me but wasted no time pulling me into a comforting hug. Linda and Lauren rushed down the stairs, their faces lighting up with joy. "Dad," they cried, throwing their arms around me. After breakfast, I took them to school, savoring the rare moment of normalcy. Once I returned, Klaus had already left for work, leaving Rose and me to talk things over at the kitchen table. By the time we finished our long conversation, we came to the same sobering realization. The pieces of Marcy's double life had been falling apart from all directions, and now, there was no turning back for anyone involved. I soon learned that a neighbor had called the cops after an incident involving Marcy. She didn't survive. The hardest thing I've ever had to do was sit my daughters down and tell them their mother was gone. That pain stayed with me, echoing through every decision I made from that point on. It's been 5 years now. Life has moved forward, though the scars remain. I stood by the window today, watching Linda and Lauren wait for the school bus. Nearby, Maureen, my wife, laughed as she chased our 2 preschool boys around the yard. The gas station and convenience store we built have become the heart of our little village. It's a place where neighbors gather, share stories, and support one another. At the crossroads leading into town, Bill erected a sign that says it all: we're all here because of circumstances. It's a reminder of how life can steer you down unexpected paths, shaping something beautiful out of what once seemed broken.